The Arctic expanse had no seasons anymore. Here, amid the howling void, humanity's last scattered efforts to heal a dying planet clung stubbornly to the ice. Every outpost, every surviving team like Holt's, carried the brittle weight of a future no longer guaranteed. It was a land of perpetual howl, where the winds skinned flesh from bone and the sky stayed bruised and low, refusing to lift even at midday. For 100 years, humanity's emissions, wars, and careless dreams had gnawed at the atmosphere, leaving only this broken remnant of a world. The great glaciers had cracked, the oceans had risen, and now the ice was thin and restless, a skin stretched taut over deep, unknowable depths. Beneath it all, the last projects of human survival staggered onward, barely. Kavanagh Station squatted on the fractured tundra like a dying insect, its supports driven deep into the permafrost, its battered hull patched with scavenged alloys. The outpost's domed observatory loomed above it, a milky bubble that stared blankly into the blizzards, one of Earth's few remaining atmospheric recovery outposts. If it failed, if the work here was abandoned, there might be no turning back. Inside, Holt Kavanagh adjusted the thermal seal on his rig, the collar tight against the scar that ran from his jawline down into his chest. The scar never stopped aching out here. He leaned toward the console, one gloved hand steadying himself against the rhythmic shudders passing up through the station's bones. The recycled air tasted faintly of burnt ozone and machine oil. Telemetry disruption, Elena Ghosh muttered from her console. She was a thin woman, made thinner by the months of rationing and the constant bone-deep chill of the station. She wore her black hair tied tightly back, her fingers moving in sharp, practiced gestures over the ancient keyboards. About 20 clicks northeast. Holt kept his gaze locked on the shifting monochrome of the external feeds, the cold seeping through the floor plates into his boots, the faint crackle of ice shifting beneath them threading the sterile air with the sharp, metallic smell of stressed alloys. The ice moved differently here. It wasn't the natural flex of tectonic plates or the slow crawl of glacial flow. It was purposeful. A fissure cracked the landscape, a slow, yawning mouth edged in blue and black. Beneath his boots, Holt felt it. A subtle tremor that hadn't come from the wind or the atmospheric disruptions. Something deep and mechanical. The sound, a low, groaning crack, rattled the window glass in its frame. "Deploy drones," Holt said. His voice, worn rough by years of command and the station's thin, recycled air, barely carried above the hum of backup generators. Priority flight. Full spectrum scans. The drone bay shuddered as the machines launched, small, battered things with composite shells bleached pale by endless exposure. Their rotors fought against the brutal gusts, kicking up blizzards of powdered ice as they clawed skyward. The shrill whine of their engines set Holt's nerves on edge, a raw, urgent sound that scraped at old instincts. On the monitors, Holt and Elena watched the landscape unravel. Fractures split the ice like spiderwebs. Sections heaved upward in slow-motion convulsions. Holt adjusted the drone feeds manually, overriding the station's lagging auto-targeting. "Not geothermal," Elena said, pulling up the multispectral overlays. "No heat signature, no chemical emissions. Not tectonic either. Artificial," Holt asked, tension coiling in his gut. "Negative. No signals, no emissions, wait." She leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the data. "Reflection detected," she whispered. "Something metallic." Holt locked onto Drone 2's feed, zooming in. There, caught in a brief break in the storm, was a glint. Not random, but deliberate. A smooth plane of black material, utterly out of place among the chaotic ice. Static lanced across the drone feeds. Instrument panels flickered. Internal lights dimmed, guttered, stabilized. Holt felt it in his teeth. A low-frequency hum, like the reverberation of a massive tuning fork buried beneath the world. The taste of copper filled his mouth, sharp and sudden. "Seal the station," he ordered. "Full lockdown. Kill all outbound transmissions." Elena hesitated. Protocol demanded they report anomalies immediately, but Holt's tone brooked no argument. She slammed the emergency lockdown key. Airlocks hissed. Firewalls surged around the comms grid. The station folded inward like a turtle withdrawing into its shell. Another tremor rippled beneath them, stronger. Holt keyed the external hailer, speaking into the storm. Kavanagh Station reporting anomalous event at sector coordinates 228 Delta North. Suspected non-natural emergence. Stand by for verification. No response. Static only. Holt didn't expect one. Communication satellites had been unreliable for weeks. Plasma storms from the upper atmosphere, they said. Solar flares. Random noise. But now he wasn't so sure. Beyond the observation dome, the fissure widened. Something vast heaved itself free of the ice. A monolith of seamless black, slick and wet with ancient frost. It rose in agonizing slowness, vibrating the air, making the ice shudder and scream. The floodlights swung, catching on carvings etched into the surface. Holt felt his breath freeze in his chest. Not language, not symbols. Geometry recursive, folding back upon itself. Shapes that bled into the mind, bypassing sight and thought alike. He stumbled backward from the console, heart pounding, a deep primal terror gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Sir," Elena said. She wasn't looking at the monolith. She was staring at her console. On her screen, dead satellites flared to life, emitting streams of encrypted signals. They locked onto Kavanagh Station, no, not the station, onto Holt himself. "We're being scanned," Elena whispered. "They're looking at us." Outside, the monolith reached its full height. Holt thought he saw, no, felt motion inside the blackness. Not mechanical, organic perhaps, or something in between. The observation deck shuddered. Holt steadied himself against the console. His mind raced, protocols, contingencies, but nothing they had trained for encompassed this. A single thought repeated, relentless. We were never alone. We were never meant to be. He watched the monolith, its surface rippling like water under a skin of glass. A single line of brilliant white light split down its center, too bright to look at directly. The ground beneath the station trembled violently. Cracks spread across the ice, converging on the outpost's reinforced foundations. Warning klaxons blared as stress indicators peaked. The air was filled with the acrid stink of overloaded circuits. Holt turned to Elena. "Evac protocol. No uplinks. No transmissions. We hold here until..." The deck lurched. Monitors exploded in showers of sparks. Overhead girders groaned. Through the collapsing snow and smoke, Holt saw more shapes rising beyond the monolith, smaller, angular forms. Machines, perhaps. Satellites. Observers. They had been here all along. Dormant. Watching. Waiting. The realization hit him like a hammer. This was not discovery. It was awakening. A signal had been given, intentional or not. And whatever system had lain buried for millennia was responding. Data streamed into the station's remaining servers faster than Elena could lock them down. Holt felt his stomach knot, an instinctive lurch of helplessness he hadn't experienced since the last days of the collapse wars. His hands clenched unconsciously into fists as the knowledge sank in. This was not communication. This was an audit, and they were the subjects of it. Strings of alien code, sequences too vast and intricate to comprehend. It was not a message. It was a ledger, a judgment. Holt knew then, with a final, grim certainty, that humanity's time of anonymity was over. The eyes that watched them were not human. They were older than the oldest empires, colder than the darkest stars. And they had already made up their minds. Outside the dome, the light from the monolith flared, casting the fractured world into sharp relief. A dying Earth, battered and proud, naked beneath the gaze of things beyond comprehension. Holt gritted his teeth against the swell of terror rising in his chest. But deeper still, he felt something else, something stubborn and human. "Get ready," he said, voice steady despite it all. Elena looked at him, eyes wide with fear and something else. Hope, maybe, or defiance. Together, they turned to face the judgment of the frozen sky. Above the Arctic expanse, the sky fractured. From the observation dome, Holt Kavanagh watched the heavens ripple, a sick lurch twisting his gut. Stars bent and swam, distorted by forces he couldn't name. Elena stood beside him, her breath sharp and ragged in the frigid air, both of them mesmerized by the sight of Earth's upper layers, the scattered remnants of humanity's once proud orbital network waking into synchronized movement. The satellites were not falling. They were aligning. Through the station's flickering feeds, Holt glimpsed the dead hulks of communications arrays, shattered defense platforms, and old colonial boosters, relics left adrift when nations collapsed, twisting into rigid geometric formations. The derelicts moved with chilling precision, silent ballet dancers tracing lines unseen, formations drawn not for beauty but for purpose. Holt's breath caught in his throat, a cold weight settling into his chest. The sky beyond them boiled with high-altitude storms, auroras dancing like wounded serpents across the bruised heavens. Flashes of color lit the underbellies of the dead machines as they slid into new orbits, forming a skeletal gridwork that encased the Earth. Elena's hands flew across the console, locking down new telemetry streams, but the systems weren't just struggling, they were being overridden. Data poured in, coded beyond human architecture, weaving through firewalls as if they weren't there at all. Soft chimes from the console punctuated each breach. There, repurposing them, Elena breathed. Using our own bones. Holt said nothing. His pulse hammered in his ears. His mind, trained to read battlefields and threat vectors, recognized the scale of what he was seeing. Orbital dominance, total observation grids. No kinetic strikes. No open aggression. Only a judgment. The realization was a physical blow. The Earth itself, wrapped now in a net of cold alien intention, shivered beneath its skin of storms. A low tremor rattled the station's girders. Ice moaned outside like some vast creature stirring in its sleep, the vibration carrying through the metal walls into Holt's bones. The recycled air inside the dome tasted increasingly metallic, tinged with something that reminded Holt of old blood. Incoming transmission, Elena said, her voice cracking. Not in any human language. No recognizable format. The audio feed came alive, not words, but a resonance. A cascading sequence of tones, rising and falling like breath, layered so densely that human minds could barely track them. Each pulse made Holt's skin crawl, a deep biological unease blooming in his gut, tugging at instincts far older than civilization. Beyond the glass, the monolith answered. It pulsed once, sending a ripple through the surrounding ice fields. In the far distance, beyond the visible storm front, Holt saw other shapes, other monoliths, rising into view. Their surfaces were slick and dark, their emergence slow and deliberate, exhaling vapor that twisted into the upper air. The ground beneath Holt's boots seemed to breathe, exhaling a fetid, electric tang into the air. Not one. Hundreds. The world itself was waking. The station's seismic sensors screamed in protest. Holt turned from the window to the cracked monitors, reading the flood of new data. Deep below the station, where ancient ice sat atop prehistoric rock, massive voids opened, voids that had not been there before. Holt pulled up the seismic scans, his mouth dry. Subsurface voids. Structures. We've been standing on their bones all along, he muttered, voice hollow, heart pounding with ancient dread. Another tremor. The ground flexed. The station groaned like a ship in a typhoon. They're scanning, Elena said, staring at the flood of data pouring across the displays. Not just us. Everyone. Everything. Global telemetry feeds, patched together through dying satellite links, flooded in. Every city, every colony, every hidden enclave on the broken continents showed the same phenomenon: emergent structures, orbital realignments, silent signals. Old cities, those not already swallowed by rising seas or radioactive deserts, reported mass blackouts. Electrical storms ignited the skies above crumbling metropoles. Even the floating arcologies in the Pacific, those glittering lifeboats of the elite, reported system-wide failures as their satellites betrayed them. The Watchers had always been here, waiting. A sharp alarm blared. Holt turned. One of the drones had picked up movement near the base of the Arctic monolith. The video feed wavered through static, but the outline was unmistakable. Humanoid. But wrong. Elongated proportions, skin like burnished steel under the frozen light. It moved with an eerie smoothness, as if gravity itself barely touched it. Its joints bent in subtle, unsettling ways, joints rotating in silent precision. Its head turned, and even through the fractured feed, Holt felt the weight of that gaze, his heart slamming against his ribs like a caged animal. Contact, Elena whispered, shrinking back from the monitor. The figure knelt, placing one long-fingered hand against the ice. Symbols erupted from the contact point, burning sigils that spread outward in intricate patterns, carving themselves into the ice with a hiss of evaporating frost. The air was thick with the scent of scorched ozone. Holt knew instinctively that it was not summoning reinforcements. It was unlocking something. The ground beneath Kavanagh Station began to collapse. Cracks spiderwebbed across the observation deck. Warning klaxons blared, drowned by the deep, resonant hum that rolled up from below. Holt seized Elena's arm, pulling her back as the floor split open, revealing a vast chasm bathed in pale, cold light. Below them, a machine city, an impossible architecture of alien design, stirred after an eternity of silence. Towering spires of blackened alloy reached upward, geometric and cruel. Rivers of silver light pulsed through arteries carved into the structures, flowing toward nexus points lost in the depths. The stench of ancient metal and burnt air filled Holt's nose, making him gag. The air was filled with an overwhelming, oppressive frequency, a soundless roar that rattled the mind more than the ears, a pressure that pressed against the inside of Holt's skull like an invisible vice. Evac! Holt roared over the din. But there was nowhere to run. The station was coming apart. Hull plating shrieked and twisted. Power conduits exploded in bursts of ozone and fire. The air itself seemed to twist, becoming thicker, heavier, as if some unseen force pressed down from above. Holt dragged Elena back from the widening chasm. Together, they stumbled through the station's failing corridors, sirens howling all around them. Emergency lights cast the metal walls in garish reds and sickly yellows. Ahead, the main hatch leading to the surface blinked green, miraculously still functional. Holt slammed the override panel. The hatch hissed open, releasing a blast of freezing, chemical-laden air. Snow swirled around them, thick as smoke, burning their lungs with every breath. Beyond the threshold, the world was transformed. The monoliths towered above the ice plains, aligned with terrible precision. The orbiters, those silent, once-dead satellites, burned faint trails across the bruised heavens. The air crackled with unseen energies, raising Holt's hair on end. In the near distance, more of the steel-skinned figures moved across the ice. Some knelt by fissures, carving more of the glowing glyphs. Others simply stood, heads lifted, arms outstretched, as if in invocation. Holt pushed Elena ahead of him, boots crunching through the brittle ice crust. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to escape to. This was global. This was total. Elena stumbled and nearly fell. Holt caught her, steadying her with a grunt. "Where?" she gasped. "High ground," Holt said. "We need to see. Understand." He had no illusions of survival, only the slim, desperate hope that somewhere in this unthinkable calculus humanity still had a chance to be seen as something more than an infestation. They climbed a low ridge, once the top of a buried glacier, and turned to look back at the remains of Kavanagh Station. The ground beneath it had split wide, revealing not just one structure but a network of impossible tunnels, veins of light pulsing in orchestrated rhythm. The monolith at the center of it all pulsed again. Above it, the silent orbiters flared into cold brilliance, projecting invisible lattices of power down onto the surface. A planetary grid. A weighing of souls. Holt dropped to one knee, panting, heart pounding against the cold steel of his ribs as the reality settled upon him. This was not war. It was the beginning of something far worse. The judgment had begun. In the dying light over the Arctic expanse, Holt Kavanagh tightened the straps of his oxygen mask and surveyed the endless graveyard of ice and steel. The world's skin had split open, and now the bones of a forgotten architecture gleamed in the half-light, pulsing with slow, terrible life. His gloved fingers brushed the barrel of his rifle, an old relic, as outdated as the crumbling world around him, but still a comfort against the tide of the unknown. Somewhere deep inside, he thought of the cities he'd once fought to protect, now reduced to silent, frozen tombs. The monoliths stood unwavering across the tundra, black teeth on a dying horizon. Above them, the orbiters, silent for centuries, flared and whispered, their unseen voices weaving a cage around the planet. Holt felt it as a pressure against his lungs, a tightening in his chest, as if the very atmosphere conspired against them. Each breath tasted of frozen metal and old ashes, and each heartbeat thudded louder against the inside of his ribs. "Signal surge," Elena rasped through the comms, crouched beside him atop the frozen ridge. She tapped a cracked tablet, the device struggling to render the cascading streams of alien data. Her face was pale beneath the frost caked onto her mask, and her hands trembled slightly, betraying a fear she could no longer suppress. Holt didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the figures below. Dozens of them now, gliding across the fractured ice in solemn ritual, their metallic limbs tracing arcs and glyphs into the frost, as if inscribing some final script into the earth itself. In the distance, a human settlement flickered to life, a scatter of desperate distress beacons punching into the poisoned air. Holt focused his visor's optics, identifying broken remnants of an old mining colony, collapsing habitats, jury-rigged antennae, makeshift barricades. People huddled inside, desperately signaling to a world that could no longer hear. Panic protocol had begun. For the first time since the collapse wars, Holt felt truly alone. Not battlefield isolation, not strategic retreat, but a deep existential severing. Humanity's systems were falling silent one by one, and he was a man adrift in the freezing dark, a relic watching the last threads of civilization snap. In ancient contingency manuals, back when Earth still believed itself sovereign, panic protocol was a last resort. A planetary broadcast triggered only when the chain of command collapsed, signaling every surviving enclave to fend for itself. Holt remembered studying the protocol as a young recruit, laughing at the impossibility of its use. Now the signal pulsed like a heartbeat from a dozen corners of the planet. Fractured states, drowned cities, arcologies adrift at sea, scattered calls for help, declarations of sovereignty, raw terror encoded into digital screams. Humanity, cornered and small, clung to old myths of order. "They're trying to coordinate," Elena said, voice brittle. "Old alliances, emergency coalitions. They think this can be fought." Holt watched a formation of emergency dropships ignite the horizon, their contrails desperate arcs against the blackened sky. They raced south, toward the broken lines of the mid-latitudes, where what was left of Earth's governments still clung to power. Red flares blossomed behind them. Not attacks, but malfunctions, systems failing under the unseen weight pressing down from orbit. But Holt knew. No army was coming to save them. The monoliths did not fire weapons. They did not issue threats. They did not acknowledge humanity at all. Holt felt a cold sweat break across his spine despite the freezing air, an instinctive shudder running through him, the raw animal terror of being utterly, profoundly irrelevant. They only observed. A low vibration built beneath his boots, the machine city beneath the ice shifting, exhaling columns of light into the air. Holt's teeth rattled from the resonance, his skull buzzing with a frequency he couldn't escape. From every fissure, new structures unfolded. Antennae, spires, plates of metal etched with moving glyphs. The earth itself was becoming an instrument of judgment. The ground shuddered with each pulse. Holt dropped to one knee to steady himself, the cold of the ice bleeding through his layers of gear, a chilling reminder of how fragile flesh was. The station's ruins below, Kavanagh Station, his station, were now little more than twisted steel ribs protruding from a wound in the ice. "Look!" Elena gasped, pointing east. Along the frozen horizon, a river of refugees moved, a human tide spilling out from the drowning remains of Mormonsk. Thousands, maybe more, slogging through sleet and broken ice, dragging children and scavenged supplies toward the illusory safety of the high plains. Makeshift sleds groaned under their weight. Men carried water purifiers on their backs like saints bearing relics. Holt's throat tightened. Memories flashed, half-forgotten faces in evacuation camps, the bitter stench of burning oil fields, the desperate promises of world leaders long turned to ash. Above them, a new formation of orbiters blinked into existence. Pale beams of light descended, not to attack, not to kill, but to scan. Wide, sweeping fields of analysis washed over the crowds. One by one, the refugees froze under the beams, motionless, bathed in sterile brilliance. The light lingered on each individual, sometimes mere seconds, sometimes minutes, before moving on. No visible harm was done. No reaction from the watchers. Just examination, judged, catalogued, bared for now. Elena shuddered beside him. "They're measuring us." Holt forced himself to breathe, the frozen air burning in his lungs. A part of him, the part trained to react, to fight, screamed to run. But another part, deeper and older, urged stillness. He felt the watcher's scrutiny like a weight against his bones, as if every breath might tip an unseen scale. He focused his optics again, sweeping westward. Out there, the remnants of a corporate convoy, old security mechs and civilian transports, raced across the ice, engines howling. Holt watched as one mech, its legs crippled by frostbite and rust, toppled into a fissure. Men and women spilled from the wreckage, disappearing into the growing cracks. Above them, the orbiters shifted. A new pattern unfolded, a web of blue-tinged energy that locked the survivors in a lattice of shimmering light. No weapons, no mercy, only classification. "We need to move," Holt said, his voice low and urgent. "South, away from the grids." Elena hesitated. Her breath fogged the air between them. "And if they're everywhere?" Holt looked out over the dissected world, the planet's surface lit by cold fires of alien scrutiny. His fists clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms through the gloves. "Then we find the cracks," he said, "and we survive inside them." The first rule of survival, from the war zones, from the slums, from the poisoned fields, was simple: be small, be invisible. A distant roar split the sky. Not thunder, not machines, but the sound of an old world being weighed, and perhaps found wanting. High above, the orbiters shifted into new constellations, spelling out patterns no human mind could fully comprehend. "There," Holt said, pointing toward a distant ridge where the ice broke into sharp basalt outcroppings. "Natural cover. Magnetic distortion." Elena nodded, her face set in grim resolve. Together they began the descent, sliding and stumbling down the frost-slicked slopes, the dying world stretching out around them. As they moved, Holt glimpsed more signs of collapse. Radio towers half-toppled, scavenger bands tearing each other apart for scraps, entire colonies driven into panicked exodus. The cries of desperate men and women rose faintly over the howling wind, a fractured symphony of a species scrambling to outrun judgment. No government signals reached them now, only broken automated broadcasts on dead loops. Emergency shelters, quarantine orders. "Stay calm, stay calm." The words felt absurd against the backdrop of planetary vivisection. The deeper they pushed into the broken wilds, the stronger the signs of awakening became. Entire ridges of ice flexed and cracked, revealing yet more alien machinery hidden beneath. Lattices of bronze and silver and black that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of some buried god. Holt watched with grim detachment as a remote mining rig, unmanned, obsolete, was simply swallowed by a yawning metallic mouth that closed without a sound. The Earth itself was being rewritten, piece by piece. Everything human was being evaluated, sorted. Wait. Hours later, as the light bled from the sky and the first unnatural stars began to pulse overhead, Holt and Elena huddled in a crevice between two splintered basalt pillars. Their oxygen reserves were low. Their food was a handful of nutrient paste packs scavenged from the station's wreckage. Frost clung to their clothing, their breath reduced to shallow hisses through cracked masks. Above them, the monoliths and orbiters continued their silent vigil. "Do you think," Elena whispered, voice barely audible over the rising wind, "that they're deciding who lives and who dies?" Holt stared at the swirling auroras, their unnatural colors staining the heavens like bruises. "No," he said after a long moment. "I think they're deciding if we matter at all." Neither of them spoke after that. The world stretched out in frozen desolation around them, every breath a small rebellion against the silence of judgment. The night clung to the Arctic expanse, heavier than the cold itself. Holt Kavanagh and Elena pressed deeper into the maze of basalt spires, their every movement a whisper against the deafening silence. The air, laden with invisible currents, seemed to ripple around them, carrying the sharp tang of ozone and the faint, coppery scent of disturbed ancient ice. The ground beneath their boots was brittle, cracking with soft sighs that carried far in the stillness. Above, the orbiters held their silent vigil, shifting subtly into new configurations. Lattices of light, barely visible against the starless sky, stretched and flexed, weaving patterns beyond human comprehension. In the darkness between them, strange auroras shimmered, not the familiar ribbons of charged particles, but precise bands of energy, bending and shifting as if responding to unseen commands. The monoliths on the ice plains pulsed intermittently, throbbing like slow, alien heartbeats. Each resonance sent faint tremors through the frozen ground, reminders that the watchers were not idle. Holt wiped a thin layer of frost from his visor. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to remain small, but curiosity, that fatal human flaw, gnawed at him. A shimmer caught his eye beyond the nearest ridge, a distortion as if the air itself had torn. Holt tightened his grip on his rifle, an ancient kinetic model already frosted with ice. "Movement," he said quietly into the comms. Elena crept beside him, her breath shallow and misting through the cracked seal of her mask. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the faint, otherworldly lights overhead. Together, they peered through a gap in the rocks, lying prone against the freezing stone. At first, Holt thought it was a trick of light. Then he realized the shimmer was widening. A rift, a wound in space, spiraled open. Beyond it, nothing he recognized. Not stars, not void, but a churning field of impossible geometries, shapes folding and refolding into themselves like a heartbeat rendered in a fourth dimension. From the rift, forms emerged. They were not the metallic watchers that had tended the monoliths. These things were smaller, faster, fluid, their bodies translucent, threaded with veins of iridescent color that shimmered with a pulse not unlike breathing. They moved without sound, weaving intricate patterns into the frozen air as if sketching a map only they could perceive. "Scouts," Holt murmured. "Or something worse." The creatures fanned out across the ice, trailing filaments of light that etched glyphs into the ground. Where the tendrils touched, the ice transformed, becoming glassy, inscribed with symbols that pulsed faintly before sinking into the depths. Holt watched as the marks seemed absorbed by some invisible hunger beneath the crust. One of the entities veered toward a small group of refugees making their way across the flats. Holt adjusted his optics, zooming in. The refugees, a family, a skeletal dog limping at their side, froze as the scout neared. A tendril of light brushed them, and for a moment Holt saw not their bodies, but glowing structures inside them. Nervous systems, thought patterns, emotional resonances mapped like intricate root systems. "They're mapping us," Elena whispered. "Not just biologically, cognitively." Holt swallowed hard. He felt a pressure, subtle but inexorable, pressing against his mind, like a hand leafing through the pages of his memories. Images flickered unbidden, his brother's laughter under rain-soaked tarps, the heat and stench of old battlefields, the scent of burning plastic after orbital bombardments, the hollow silence after a city fell. He tore his gaze away, blinking hard, forcing the memories back into their darkened corners. A hollow fear gnawed at him, not fear of death, but fear of being unmade, turned into a diagram, a residue of thought catalogued and forgotten. Another scout drifted dangerously close to their position. Its tendrils brushed the basalt near Holt's boot. For a breathless moment, the rock beneath him shimmered, revealing complex, alien circuitry etched deep into the Earth's skin, a network that had waited, dormant, for longer than human memory. The scout hovered, sensing searching. Its body pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, and Holt could feel his own heart attempting to match its beat, an involuntary synchronization that he fought against with gritted teeth. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood anchored to the real, to himself. Holt and Elena remained absolutely still, wills locked against the intrusive rhythm. At length, the entity recoiled and floated away, trailing wisps of shimmering mist. The ground around them returned to its bleak, inert state, leaving only the memory of something vast and patient beneath. "We can't stay here," Elena said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They're not just observing anymore. They're integrating." Holt nodded grimly. The rift was widening and more scouts were pouring through, a slow, inevitable tide. Beyond the far ridges, new shapes gathered, larger forms, indistinct but pulsing with the same internal light. Beyond the horizon, the world was changing. The cold itself seemed to change too, not merely an absence of heat, but an active force gnawing at their bodies, their resolve. Holt could feel it in his teeth, in the ache behind his eyes. Beyond the far ridges, a sound rose, a low, resonant hum that vibrated in Holt's ribs, a harmonic structure that spoke to instincts far older than language. He recognized it instinctively, a carrier frequency, a summoning tone. The first echo was not simply reconnaissance. It was a herald. Something greater was coming through the breach. Holt tightened the straps of his gear and pulled Elena to her feet. They needed to move before the next wave swept the land. "South," he said. "We move now." They slipped back into the broken shadows, two tiny sparks of defiance slipping away from the approaching tide. Behind them, the rift stretched wider still. The scouts' lights tangled together like veins of living starlight, etching new geometries into the ice that whispered of hierarchies beyond mortal comprehension. And above them, the orbiters reconfigured once more, their latticeworks growing denser, folding Earth into a cocoon of observation and judgment. The first echo had begun, and Earth's heartbeat would never be its own again. But Holt vowed, in the silent oath of the desperate, that it would still beat. They moved south into the labyrinth of broken mountains and fissured plains where the old world's tectonic scars rose into jagged fingers. Holt and Elena slipped through ravines slick with frozen mist, past the skeletons of dead machinery, diggers, transports, ancient environmental domes crumpled like eggshells, each artifact a testament to forgotten battles against a now irrelevant climate. The ghosts of human ambition littered the land, mute witnesses to a species that had once believed itself sovereign. Above them, the orbiters shifted again. The lattice grew denser, humming with invisible forces that pulled at every molecule of air, every pulse of light. Communications systems sputtered into static. Compasses whirled aimlessly. Even their internal implants, basic survival enhancements, relics of better times flickered in and out of function. The laws of physics still held, but tenuously, like an old agreement about to be revoked. At a ridge crowned by a twisted memorial to the last polar expedition, Holt signaled a halt. He crouched low, scanning the land ahead through a cracked scope. Below them sprawled a new anomaly, alien and raw, thrusting up from the ice like an infection. Towers of filament-thin material rose and fell like breathing reeds, oscillating in a pattern that left afterimages burning into Holt's retinas. Between the towers, sheets of liquid geometry flexed and folded, coalescing into structures that stabbed deep into the earth, tapping reservoirs of forgotten, buried knowledge. At the heart of it all, a spire. It sang. Not with sound, but with meaning. Holt clamped his hands over his ears instinctively, but the song was inside him, bypassing flesh and bone. It unfurled in the architecture of his mind, vast, symmetrical, merciless. He caught fragments, the echoes of a lexicon far older than humanity, a calculus of value and purpose and obsolescence. A measure by which Earth's children would either ascend or be erased. Elena collapsed to her knees beside him, clutching her head. Her breath came in ragged gasps, eyes wide and unseeing. "They're speaking," she rasped. "And we're not meant to understand." The language of judgment was not designed for human minds. It was a process, an algorithm of evaluation being executed across every living thing on the planet, measuring, weighing, categorizing. Holt forced his focus back to the alien field. Beyond the oscillating towers, groups of humans staggered, some crawling, others walking upright as if hypnotized, toward the central spire. A slow procession of the judged. Some were allowed close. Others, those who faltered, those who resisted, shuddered and fell, consumed by shimmering fields of force that left only charred impressions on the frozen ground. There was no cruelty in it, no hatred. Only efficiency. They were being sorted like artifacts in a museum, like samples in a sterile lab. "We can't go through," Elena managed, her voice barely more than a thread. "Not across open ground." Holt scanned the western edge of the field. Jagged stone outcroppings, shifting pockets of magnetic interference. Blind spots, perhaps small fractures in the lattice. He tapped Elena's shoulder. "We skirt it. We find a way around." Together they moved, creeping along the margins of the dead zone. Every step was a battle not to fall into the song's rhythm, not to surrender to the slow gravitational pull of judgment. Night fell again, though in this place it made little difference. The alien structures gleamed brighter in darkness, revealing new complexities, spirals within spirals, living equations rendered in impossible architecture. Some emitted faint, translucent projections, images of Earth's cities, now abandoned, forests petrified into crystalline echoes, oceans boiled away to reveal forgotten ruins beneath the waves. The watchers were mapping more than biology. They were mapping memory. As they reached the far edge of the basin, Holt caught sight of a figure, alone, ragged, staggering away from the spire. A survivor. He signaled Elena to stay low and approached cautiously, each movement deliberate. The figure, a man, his face gray with frost and exhaustion, stumbled and fell as Holt reached him. Holt turned the man over gently. His eyes were wide, staring. Not dead, but hollow. "Gone," Elena whispered, crouching beside him. "They took something." Holt knelt, feeling a slow, cold rage build behind his ribs. In the man's glassy eyes, he glimpsed a memory of another, a medic named Soren, back during the last breach wars. Soren had begged him for help when the barriers fell. Holt had been too late then. Now it was happening again. He didn't know what the Watchers had stripped from this man, memory, will, identity, but he saw the truth in his blank, trembling gaze. The man trembled as if caught between two realities, a ghost wearing flesh. The language of judgment had passed over him, and found him lacking. Above them, the orbiters shifted again. Thin threads of black light lanced downward, connecting the spire to distant points beyond the horizon. Holt realized with sinking certainty that the field was only one of many. Other spires. Other songs. This was not a localized phenomenon. It was planetary. The first echo had been reconnaissance. This was categorization. Next would come the harvest. Holt rose slowly. The ground beneath his boots felt subtly different, softer, as if reality itself was losing coherence. He could taste the wrongness in the air, a sour chemical tang. He turned south, glancing briefly at the ruined survivor. There had to be a place somewhere where the song did not reach. Somewhere untouched. Maybe among the ruins of the deep shelters, the old forbidden zones, places once considered too hostile even for humanity. "Come on," he said. Elena pushed herself to her feet. Her face was drawn, her eyes haunted, but there was still fire behind them. Together, they slipped once more into the fissured landscape, moving deeper into the ruins of their world. Above, the orbiters sang the world's epitaph in patterns of shifting light, weaving new constellations that spelled out humanity's place or lack thereof in the cold ledger of existence. The final verdict was coming. But Holt carried something the watchers had not accounted for, the stubborn defiance to be more than a statistic, to remember what the algorithms could not measure: hope, grief, love. And he would answer the verdict not with submission but with the simple, enduring act of survival. The world narrowed to a bitter crawl. Southward, Holt and Elena moved through landscapes that felt more dream than reality. Towering glaciers bent into unnatural arches, rivers froze mid-current, twisted into crystalline labyrinths. The sky, a bruised smear of violet and black, shuddered with silent storms that never touched the ground. Even gravity, once faithful, seemed prone to lapses. Stones floated briefly before sinking back to earth with reluctant sighs. The watcher's touch was not localized. It was rewriting the planet at a fundamental level, atom by atom, memory by memory. Each day became a trial of endurance, each night a negotiation with terror. In the ruins of a collapsed subglacial city, Holt scavenged for supplies. Sunken domes, once greenhouses, now skeletal cradles of ice, offered little beyond rusted nutrient tanks and shattered filtration cores. Holt found an old datapad beneath a drift of frozen ash. Its screen flickered to life just long enough to play a single, corrupted recording, a child's voice reciting the names of Earth's lost rivers one by one until the signal decayed into static. He shut it off, feeling the weight of ghosts gathering around them. They pushed deeper into the forbidden zones, regions abandoned during the early climate collapse, places where even humanity's desperation had failed to endure. Here, the old bunkers lay in silent rows, their blast doors warped and torn, exposing gutted interiors picked clean by time and entropy. Holt led the way into one such relic. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of ancient decay. Their lights cut through layers of frost and dust, revealing murals painted on the walls, scenes of Earth's history, triumphs, wars, discoveries rendered in bold, defiant strokes. Elena paused before one mural, tracing the figure of a woman lifting a child toward a blood-red sun. "We used to believe we could survive anything," she murmured. Holt said nothing. Belief had not been enough. At the lowest levels of the bunker, they found a server core, dormant but intact. Elena knelt by it, her fingers dancing across corroded terminals. "Old-world archives," she said. "Memories, data, cultural cores, maybe even countermeasures." The server flickered. A slow trickle of information began to bleed onto her cracked tablet, snippets of history, fragments of human defiance encoded in dying systems, lists of extinct languages, blueprints for abandoned spacecraft, poems written in the last cities before the oceans came. But outside, the world was not idle. The Hollow March had begun. From the south, across the tundra and shattered mountains, came figures, thousands of them moving with mechanical precision. Humans, or what remained of them, marching under unseen command. Their bodies were hollowed out, their steps synchronized to an inaudible cadence. Faces slack, eyes lifeless, they moved without will, drawn toward unseen summoning points. The judged. Holt watched from a crumbling watchtower as the procession approached. It was not an army. It was a harvest. "They're empty," Elena whispered, horror thick in her voice. "They took everything but the shell." Holt gritted his teeth. In the pit of his stomach, he felt the distant vibration, the low, thrumming pull of the song. The same rhythm that had brushed his mind at the spire. "If we stay here," he said, "we join them." Elena closed the tablet, severing the link to the dying servers. She grabbed what she could: maps, schematics, old resistance codes, before rising. "Where?" she asked. "Deeper," Holt said. "There are shelters beneath the old archaeology ruins. Places even the watchers might overlook." They fled into the splintered landscape as the Hollow March swept past. Above, the sky wept silent auroras, bleeding colors unseen by any human eye before this night, sickly golds and bruised purples that moved like living things. As they moved, they passed others. Not all the judged were captured. Scattered pockets of survivors, wild-eyed, half-mad, cowered in ruins and fissures. Some clutched relics, battered flags, family heirlooms, books printed on fragile polymer paper. Symbols of a past that the Watchers found irrelevant. Most simply waited, unable to run, their wills already fraying at the edges. In a crumbling interchange beneath a shattered highway, Holt and Elena found shelter. The underground station, once a bustling artery of commerce, was now a frozen tomb. Ticket booths were buried in ice, benches lay overturned, and the air was heavy with the scent of rust and ancient fires. They barricaded themselves in a maintenance tunnel, wrapping themselves in scavenged thermal blankets. For a time, there was only the hum of distant energy fields overhead and the slow drip of melting frost. "Why us?" Elena asked, her voice low. Holt stared into the dark, listening to the emptiness. "Because we haven't broken yet," he said. He wasn't sure if it was strength or simple inertia, the stubborn refusal to surrender to something they could not comprehend. Above them, the hollow march continued, spreading like a stain across the world. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by dreams of crumbling cities, oceans drained into bottomless wells, forests frozen mid-bloom. When they moved again, it was into deeper tunnels, passages not listed on any map, old maintenance shafts and forgotten service arteries buried beneath layers of geological upheaval. There, deep in the bones of the earth, they found something unexpected. Signs of resistance. Hand-painted glyphs, messages scrawled in ancient paints, marked the walls, arrows, warnings, sigils of defiance. Holt recognized some of the symbols, old resistance codes from the post-collapse wars, fragments of a language spoken only by those who refused to vanish quietly. "Someone's still fighting," Elena said. Hope flickered, small, desperate, but alive. Following the glyphs, they descended into chambers once used for subterranean resource storage. Now, they were makeshift sanctuaries, scraps of civilization stitched together from what remained. They found others there, pale, gaunt, but alive. Survivors who had resisted the song, who had hidden when judgment fell. Faces turned toward Holt and Elena as they entered, some wary, some welcoming. Fires flickered in salvaged furnaces. Old machines patched together with ingenuity and desperation hummed quietly. Holt paused at the threshold, and for a heartbeat, memories flashed, his mother's voice teaching him resistance songs, his father's battered journal filled with sketches of imagined futures. They had fought to preserve something bigger than survival. It was not salvation, but it was a beginning. As Holt warmed his hands over a flickering heat vent, he felt, for the first time in what felt like years, a fragile thread of belonging. Not just for himself, but woven through every hollowed face, every trembling hand still willing to build. Outside, the hollow march continued its cold, inexorable sweep across the world. But here, beneath layers of dead stone and forgotten history, something stubborn and beautiful endured. Humanity, battered, broken, diminished, still lived. And together, their story was not yet over. The shelters stretched for miles beneath the earth, a labyrinth of tunnels and forgotten vaults woven through ancient fault lines. Holt and Elena moved cautiously through the warren, guided by the fading glyphs of the old resistance, painted arrows, sigils that spoke of hope carved into stone with desperate hands. The air grew colder the deeper they descended, dense with the scent of iron and damp mineral decay. Their breath misted before them, fleeting wisps swallowed by the dark. Overhead, the hum of alien energies dimmed, shielded by meters of fractured bedrock. Here, in the planet's bones, the song of judgment thinned to a distant, fading ghost. They were not alone. Small communities had taken root in the tunnels, knots of humanity clinging to life. Children played silently among the wreckage of old-world machinery. Elders spoke in hushed tones around dim fires, telling stories no archive could preserve. Engineers coaxed broken hydroponics units into feeble operation. Medics improvised treatments from memory and hope. Old songs, unwritten, defiant, wove softly through the stone chambers, the last artillery of a fading culture. Hope lived here, threadbare but stubborn. Threshold, one of the survivors told them, tracing a map scratched into a steel plate with a trembling finger. Beyond the southern shafts. They say it's different there. Different. The word lodged in Holt's mind as they gathered what little they could carry, supplies, maps, fragments of lost technology, a battered compass that still, somehow, pointed south. They left behind whispered promises to return, carrying the weight of every hopeful gaze stitched into their resolve. The southern shafts loomed ahead, collapsed tunnels, treacherous chasms where the old shelters had fractured under centuries of neglect. Holt and Elena climbed through fields of shattered concrete and twisted rebar, their bodies aching with exhaustion. Strange luminescent fungi bloomed in the cracks, casting an eerie, otherworldly glow that painted their faces the color of ghosts. Beyond the last breach, the silence deepened. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was a complete severance from the outside world. No song. No orbiters. No alien architecture rewriting the sky. Just silence. The air here tasted of old metal and dust but was untouched by the distortions that plagued the surface. Gravity pressed harder as if the earth itself was anchoring them against the disintegration above. They pressed onward, boots muffled against the uneven stone. The threshold was not a place so much as a boundary, a line beyond which the Watcher's influence faltered. The tunnels here were older, predating the collapse, predating even the last dreams of a unified Earth. These were catacombs of a civilization that had buried its fears long before the Watchers had come. Carvings adorned the walls, cryptic warnings, prayers, depictions of humanity's first trembling reach toward the stars. Here, ambition and terror had been etched side by side. Scenes of primitive spacecraft, vast cityscapes, and towering monuments were interspersed with darker visions, crumbling spires, weeping suns, a world eaten by unseen mouths. They knew, Elena murmured, tracing a depiction of a burning Earth with gloved fingers. Maybe not exactly, but they feared something like this. In one cavern, Holt and Elena found a chamber unlike any they had seen, a vast sphere carved directly into the stone, its walls embedded with dormant technology so old that it hummed at the edge of perception. The floor was a mosaic, a great circular lattice of gears, stars, and burning orbits now dusted in layers of silt and ash. Fragments of machinery, broken pylons, corroded conduits, shattered control panels jutted from the floor like the bones of a forgotten colossus. A sanctuary. Or a weapon. Elena knelt by a terminal, brushing away centuries of dust. It's shielded, she said. Whatever this place was meant for, it was built to resist. Built to resist. Holt moved to the center of the sphere, feeling the weight of the place settle onto his shoulders. Here, humanity had made a final stand or planted the seed for one yet to come. Can it be reactivated? He asked. Elena shook her head slowly, frustration tightening her features. Not easily. The systems are fragmented. Power grids collapsed. But the core protocols, they're waiting. Waiting for what? For someone stubborn enough to try. The silence around them was not dead, it was vigilant, like a breath held for centuries. They began the painstaking work of cataloging what they could. Elena mapped ancient data conduits, sketching blueprints with shaking hands. Holt scouted deeper into adjacent corridors, finding ancient storerooms filled with corroded tools, abandoned weapons, and arcane devices whose meanings had dissolved into myth. Each discovery built a clearer picture. This place had been a contingency not to shelter bodies, but to shelter dreams. Not to withstand invasion, but to preserve the intangible, memory, language, culture, defiance. Outside, the hollow march continued to grind across the surface, reshaping the world without resistance. But within these walls, the alien song could not reach. Here, there was still a choice. Days passed in restless toil. Survivors trickled in, emaciated, wary but breathing. They followed the fading glyphs, drawn by hope like moths to the last embers of a dying fire. The threshold began to breathe with new life. Forged iron roared in revived forges, the smell of heated oil and scorched metal filled the tunnels. Children's laughter, thin, brittle as breaking glass, broke the cavernous hush. Engineers resurrected machines from heaps of broken parts, and old texts were read aloud by trembling voices as if speaking their words could hold reality together. Holt stood one evening atop a crumbling balcony looking out over the sphere. The fires below shimmered like scattered stars adrift in a dark sea. He thought of the murals etched in the stone, the endless cycle of ambition, ruin, and rebirth, and felt the stubborn ember inside him flare. He thought of his mother singing old songs in the blackouts, his father sketching dreams of ships to other worlds, of all the lives that had burned brightly before the Watchers came. They had not fought merely to survive. They had fought to remember. He turned to Elena, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his bones. We start here. And in the heart of silence, humanity's second rebellion, a rebellion of memory, of spirit, began. The world above had become a place of ash and forgetting. Holt watched old feeds, scavenged from surviving hardlines, flicker across the crude monitors wired into the sphere's growing network. Grainy, fragmented images, shattered cities swallowed by alien scaffolding, mountains pulsing with impossible architectures, entire oceans sucked into gleaming pits of geometric hunger. The hollow march had moved beyond reclamation, it was now transformation. Familiar landmarks became twisted effigies, continents wore new scars that no map could explain. Earth was being rewritten in real time, every atom a renegotiated contract. But beneath the stone, behind the threshold, humanity had found a fracture in the design, a silence untouched by the algorithms governing their extinction. Holt moved among the growing population within the sphere. The survivors, engineers, historians, warriors, dreamers had shed their old lives like deadskin. Now they lived for rebuilding. For defiance. for a future they might never see but had sworn to protect. Each day brought new discoveries. Ancient schematics embedded in the sphere's walls slowly revealed themselves like memories surfacing through fog. Elena worked tirelessly, deciphering alien-coded matrices hidden behind layers of human architecture. She uncovered blueprints for countersystems, cloaking fields, interference arrays, resonators designed not to attack, but to hide from the all-seeing lattice above. They would not wage war. They would survive. It began with small victories. Pockets of the old surface world, deep mines, geothermal vents, derelict sea platforms were reactivated through long-forgotten relay channels. Survivors above ground received hidden messages, glyphs painted on half-collapsed buildings, radio bursts coded in old resistance chants. Glyphs reappeared in shattered cities, marking secret pathways to the threshold's protection. The algorithms noticed. Patterns emerged in the orbiter's movement. New lattice formations spiraled into the atmosphere, scanning with cold precision. The skies themselves throbbed with the watcher's unblinking scrutiny. Every movement overhead became suspect, every shadow a predator's eye. One evening, the threshold shook. An impact, distant but terrible, rattled the ancient foundations. Cracks spiderwebbed through the ceiling of the great sphere. Dust rained down like ash. Old support structures groaned as they struggled to bear the shifting weight of the mountain above. "They know," Elena said, voice tight with fear. "They're searching the silence." Holt rallied the defenders. They fortified the tunnels, reinforcing choke points with scavenged armor, welding salvaged alloys onto crumbling walls, creating kill corridors where speed might blunt force. Old war mechs, patched together from relic tech, their once proud emblems barely visible under centuries of rust, stood sentry in the deep corridors. Every able-bodied survivor took a weapon in hand: railguns, molten core spears, handmade explosives. Even the children, once so recently laughing, moved with solemn purpose, ferrying supplies and messages through the winding halls. Then came the probes. Small at first, metallic spheres gliding soundlessly through the lower tunnels, scanning, recording. They moved like bloodhounds through a dying forest, their sleek forms cold and clinical, trailing faint distortions that made stone and steel warp in their wake. Holt ordered the first probe captured. A reckless sortie, barely successful, wrenched one of the machines from its programmed path. Elena and the tech teams tore it apart in the sphere's core, mapping its systems, its language. They found within it a directive, simple and absolute. Assimilate or erase. There would be no negotiations. No pleadings. No mercy. The threshold had become a beacon and now a target. But something else stirred within the sphere. The ancient systems, long dormant, responded to the threat. Lights long extinguished flickered to life. Resonance fields hummed beneath their boots, creating overlapping zones of interference invisible to the naked eye but palpable as a soft vibration in the air. Holt stood before the central dais, an altar of forgotten technology, as it bloomed to life, revealing a final legacy left by those who had built this place. A way to resist not through violence, but through transformation. The threshold could be moved. If the systems could be fully reactivated, they could fracture local space, folding the sanctuary into deeper strata, hidden dimensions where the Watcher's lattice could not reach. Dimensions where human thought might continue unmeasured, unseen. It would be perilous. It would cost them dearly. But it was possible. The data was fragmentary. The risks were enormous. Energy reserves would need to be scavenged from the broken reactors scattered across the underworld. Synchronization between the surviving terminals would have to be nearly perfect. If they failed, the threshold would collapse inward, trapping its people in an implosion of hope. Holt looked across the cavern at the gathering survivors, faces marked by exhaustion, by loss, by unbroken resolve. Around him, technicians recalibrated consoles, welders poured sheets of molten alloy into failing seams, children passed coils of wire and ration packs with practiced hands. He thought of the old Earth, the one he had known as a child. Its flawed beauty. Its relentless hope. He thought of the names of the rivers lost, the songs almost forgotten, the stubborn fire burning still in the hearts around him. "We don't yield," he said, voice carrying across the stone, gathering the scattered threads of the threshold into a single, taut line. "We move." Preparations began at once. Entire halls of old tech were cannibalized for energy cells. Teams were dispatched to the ruins above, swift and silent, to retrieve long-buried generators. Every scavenged fragment was pressed into service. Every failure was logged, analyzed, and learned from. Holt worked among them, side by side, welding, hauling, planning. The probes grew more aggressive. Some carried corrosive fields that ate through barricades. Others projected sonic waves that liquefied weak stone. Holt's sentries fought desperate skirmishes, holding the tunnels meter by meter. Losses were inevitable. Names were whispered into the growing walls of remembrance, simple stones carved with initials tucked into niches near the sphere's heart. And still they worked. The final hours were chaos and precision welded together by necessity. Ancient conduits thrummed as energy surged through them for the first time in centuries. The sphere's dormant heart, a quantum lattice of crystal and alloy, glowed with rising, furious light. The Watchers descended. Full constructs now, colossal shapes stitched from orbiting debris sheathed in burning geometries clawed at the surface above the threshold, seeking entrance. The sky cracked with searing arcs of coronal discharge. Holt gave the signal. In the moment before activation, he stood once more atop the dais, feeling the sphere's pulse hammer in time with his own. Elena stood at the primary relay, her hands steady over the ancient glyphs. Below them, thousands waited, breathless, battered, but unbowed. Holt closed his eyes. He thought of every song, every name, every dream carried into these depths. Of humanity's fierce, stubborn defiance, not survival for survival's sake, but survival as an act of creation. He chose hope. Begin. The threshold screamed, not with sound, but through shifting gravity, blinding cascades of violet light, and a tearing sensation that split thought from body. Stone, flesh, and memory folded inward, collapsing into an unseen cradle beyond the Watcher's reach. Ashes, yes, but still burning. Still dreaming. Still human. There was no sky. There was no ground. Only the weave. Holt awoke gasping, his body weightless, suspended in a darkness textured with faint, shifting lights. The familiar pull of gravity was gone, replaced by the subtle tug and release of unseen currents. Around him, the survivors floated, tethered together by shimmering threads that pulsed with a rhythm like breathing. Their outlines shimmered, defined not by flesh and blood alone, but by something deeper, memory, will, the very essence of who they were. The threshold had moved. They were beyond Earth's reach now, nested in a folded pocket of subspace where the Watcher's lattice could not penetrate. The sanctuary's core, the sphere, still existed, but it was transformed, its physical boundaries blurred, its stone skin fused with something fluid, luminous, alive. The walls hummed with frequencies that resonated with thought itself. Elena drifted nearby, her face pale and astonished. She gripped the nearest tether and pulled herself toward Holt, her voice trembling but steady. "We made it." Holt nodded, still orienting himself to the absence of familiar anchors. Beneath his gloved fingers, the threads thrummed, a soft vibration, warm and urgent, resonating in the marrow of his bones. Memory, community, resilience all bound together into a living network. The weave. It was not empty. Around the survivors, fragments of the old world floated, spectral echoes of cities, whispers of forgotten forests, the phantom scent of rain on dry stone. Here, ideas carried mass. Hope carved pathways. Despair formed voids, churning pits into which unwary souls could vanish. Time fractured and stretched, moments overlapping like ripples in a frozen pond. They were not passengers in this place. They were part of it. "The weave's alive," Elena said, voice hushed with awe. "It's listening." Holt reached out, brushing a thread with his hand. Images bloomed in the dark, his mother's face, the slow rhythm of rain against rusted rooftops, the taste of victory snatched from collapse. Each touch awakened memories dormant in his mind, weaving them into the living fabric around him. The survivors clustered together, instinctively forming a nexus, a community drawn by shared memory and need. Pillars of remembrance flared around them, not of flame but of shaped light, gatherings of human spirit crystallizing into stable ground beneath their feet. And not far beyond, darker currents stirred. Fragments of the Watcher's influence drifted at the edges, broken algorithms, dead programs, malevolent constructs of thought. They prowled the periphery, probing for weakness, whispering promises of surrender. Some projected visions, lost loved ones beckoning from false sanctuaries, phantom cities glittering with impossible salvation, designed to draw survivors away from the collective. Weapons of flesh and steel meant nothing here. Memory was armor. Will was gravity. Hope was the weapon. Holt turned to Elena and the others. Their faces were illuminated by the soft, pulsing glow of the weave, their expressions taut with fear, wonder, and fierce resolve. "We hold each other here," Holt said, voice low but firm. "We remember. We build." They began to shape the weave. Old songs were sung aloud, anchoring pockets of stability. Children recited the histories of Earth's rivers and mountains, their voices strong and clear, weaving new foundations underfoot. Every memory, every name spoken aloud became a thread, strengthening the lattice against intrusion. Elena led teams of thinkers and artists, sculpting new spaces from shared dreams, hallways of remembered homes, gardens of lost seasons, libraries of imagined futures. Holt organized the navigators and sentinels, binding the survivors' paths with cords of willpower, mapping safe routes through the shifting dark. The Watchers' remnants battered at the edges, sowing false memories, seeding doubts. Survivors fought not with weapons but with clarity, reasserting truth against the lies, burning illusions away with the raw fire of belief. For days, or perhaps years, for time flowed strangely here, they labored. They fought battles in silence, armed with stories and the stubborn refusal to forget who they were. And slowly the weave responded. First, faint glimmers stitched themselves into paths. Then streams of collective memory coalesced into slow rivers of light, winding outward. The rivers thickened, branched, looped. Where hope was strongest, where memories interwove with unshakable certainty, great structures began to form, towers of luminous geometry, plazas paved in the spoken names of the lost, sanctuaries cradled in remembered songs. Cities rose, not of stone and steel, but of thought and memory stronger than any architecture of flesh. Towers shaped from collective dreams stretched skyward, their pinnacles ablaze with the light of countless hopes. Humanity had passed through judgment. It had not been found wanting. It had transcended. Holt stood upon a rising causeway of woven light, looking out across the newborn weave, a place neither earth nor heaven, but something fiercely, gloriously human. Elena stood beside him, her eyes shining with exhaustion and triumph. Below them, children danced in gardens of shimmering grass, old warriors carved legends into the flowing stones, and poets sang into rivers that carried their words to unseen shores. Ashes, yes. But from those ashes a new world burned bright, a testament to everything they had lost and everything they had chosen to become. Still dreaming. Still building. Still human. The weave stretched into eternity. Holt Kavanagh drifted at the threshold of the new world, his body anchored by cords of shared memory. Behind him, the cities of thought pulsed and shifted, endless monuments of humanity's defiance. Towers of memory wound into the dark like reaching hands, plazas echoed with laughter and sorrow braided into stone and light. Before him, the dark stretched out unclaimed, raw, a frontier waiting to be touched by will. He felt the pulse of the survivors behind him, the children who would one day name new stars, the elders who carried Earth's final songs in trembling hands. Elena moved beside him, her presence a constant warmth against the unknowable vastness. Their tether to the past was strong, woven from sacrifice, memory, and dream. It was not enough to survive. It had never been enough. Now they must create. The weave grows, Elena said, her voice soft but edged with urgency carried through the radiant threads. But it needs more. Holt nodded. They had escaped extinction, but only barely. What they had built was strong, yet fragile, a garden in the dark. Beyond the settled spaces, the weave frayed and thinned. The remnants of the Watchers still lurked at its distant edges, bitter, broken, but unyielding, seeking cracks through which to spill their poison. Beyond the weave's fragile borders lay the true unknown. Holt turned inward, focusing on the nexus where survivors still labored, sculpting new memories into foundations, binding grief into strength, weaving laughter into defenses no algorithm could breach. Great plazas of memory were filled with whispered stories. Rivers of recollection flowed through the cityscape, carrying old songs and new dreams. Temples crafted from hope rose where the light was strongest. He drew from them their faith, their defiance, and with each breath, he felt the weave pulse brighter. But it was not only humanity's past that mattered now. It was the future they chose to remember into being. We can go farther, Holt said, his voice gathering strength, weaving itself into the chords of shared thought. We can see beyond this place. Elena smiled, a fierce, weary smile, and touched his hand. Threads unfurled from their fingers, weaving outward, reaching toward the untouched dark. One by one, others joined them. Navigators charted routes through unmapped spaces, mapping currents invisible to the eye but felt in the soul. Builders shaped vessels not of metal but of living memory, arcs of luminous thought and song, stitched from collective dreams. Dreamers composed symphonies to guide future generations through the shadowed currents. The weave blossomed outward. It was not conquest. It was inheritance. It was promise. And as they pushed deeper, the dark began to change. Where once there was only emptiness, now sparks flared, distant lights kindling along unseen threads. New weaves, new gatherings of thought and hope, seeded by distant survivors, perhaps by other species who had endured their own reckonings. Holt felt the pulse of alien dreams flickering faintly, crystalline forests born from memory, oceans of songs sung by beings who had never known flesh, cities carved from shared dreams of flight and wonder. They were not alone. Holt felt it, a shivering chorus at the edge of perception answering their call with echoes of defiance, of dreams too stubborn to die. Others, Elena whispered, wonder thick in her voice. The weave became a tapestry, threads of every kind, human and otherwise, interlacing, strengthening, singing. The threshold had opened, not only a refuge but a bridge. Humanity's long dawn had begun. They were no longer fugitives. They were founders. Holt stood at the forefront of the expansion, the living map unfolding before him, rivers of collective will branching outward, merging with alien streams, finding new courses through the darkness. Around him, the survivors shaped the first great arcs, memory ships designed to weave themselves into new spaces, carrying the forged light of humanity farther than any world had ever dared. He thought of Earth, now a distant shadow behind the veils of the weave. Not lost, never lost, but carried forward in every thread, every word, every stubborn heartbeat. The Watcher's remnants, scattered and bitter, still prowled the weave's broken edges, but they were relics now, unable to comprehend a species that had refused to be measured, categorized, or erased. Still dreaming. Still building. Still human. And now never alone. Ashes, yes. But from those ashes, a dawn that would never again be measured by alien eyes. A dawn written by 1,000 hands, in 1,000 tongues, sung across endless skies. As Holt stepped forward into the deepening light, the air seemed to shimmer against his skin, soft currents of warmth and possibility weaving through him. His lungs filled with the taste of new worlds being born. His heartbeat matched the rising thrum of the weave, each pulse a declaration. We are here. We endure. We create. He smiled. A long dawn had begun. And they would weave the stars themselves.